Today we're taking a look at what came in Judges Guild Installment W from 1979. Please stick around. I'm AZ Mountaineer, and this is our channel, Old School Rules, a place for everyone that loves classic RPGs and anyone who'd like to learn more about them. Today's video continues our look at the products of Judges Guild and their bi-monthly installments to their subscribers. Installment W contained a Judges Guild journal and continued with the second part of the Wilderlands of the Magic Realm. Hope you enjoyed today's video. So about a month ago, we took a look at Installment V, which had the first half of this Wilderlands campaign setting. And here we got the booklet and maps for the second half, and we got the journal that came with it, would have come to the subscribers. 1979, this is April-May subscription mailing. Mark Holmer gets credit for the Magic Realms, help from Bob Bledsoe, and of course the journal is the product of Chuck Anshel and some other people. Installment W, journal, booklet, 2 double-sided maps, detailed set of maps for the judge, and then a less detailed set of maps you could share with your players. Let's take a look at the journal first. This is Aaron Arocchio's art. Initially, I saw him do art for the Dungeoneer back when Jaquays was the editor before it went to Chuck and then came over to Judges Guild. Here's our table of contents. Again, just a little bit of information we're going to have in here from various articles. Again, artwork credit. On the back, we've got a cartoon by Jaquays and some black and white art by Arocchio again, and Brian Hennon. Inside cover, we've got this really cool advertisement for Gen Con 12. Very extreme point of view looking up at this soldier. The first thing we have here is the Jocular Judgments, which is sort of their editorial written by Chuck. Thanks everybody who's a subscriber to the subscription, to the journal, to the Dungeoneer, which is now a Judges Guild product. And remember, the way they did it at this point, once the Dungeoneer magazine comes in-house, is 1 month you'd get the journal, the next month, if you got both subscriptions, you'd get the Dungeoneer. So there would be a periodical coming every month from Judges Guild. Follow-up discussion about their new, very fancy TSR computer, and they talk about the fact they're going to have a product you could buy. I think it's a cassette drive-driven computer, and they were putting out some type of product you could purchase for that. A little bit of discussion about some of the cons they want to attend, and big news for them, I think, and in the history of D&D role-playing, they've signed a licensing agreement with TSR for advanced Dungeons & Dragons products, so now they can release advanced D&D products as well. Pretty sure, my memory could be wrong about this, the only time TSR did that was with Judges Guild, first with Dungeons & Dragons and then with the AD&D trademark. They allowed them to produce those under license, and I'll mention this here and there about how they would have to send things off to TSR to get their blessing and so forth for that. This I thought was interesting. It's normally just their list of where you can get their products, but I thought people might think it was interesting to read where you could go to get products back in the day, right? This is 1979. Of course, Judges Guild itself, the Armory, Balboa Game Company out in California, Games Workshop over in London, Midwest Game and Hobby Shop in Michigan, Nagdom, which is in Buffalo, and then the journal you can get at Coulter Bennett in California, through Heritage Models, The Complete Strategist up in New York, Delaware Valley Hobby Distributors in Fulcroft, PA, Gambit Games in San Francisco, Import Marketing in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Nan's Toys and Games in Dallas, Shea Associates in Indiana, and then the Dungeoneer is available at Fantasy Games and Hobby in Muskingum, Michigan, CS&D in Denver, Colorado, Ingo Baschek, which sounds like a person, over in West Germany, and Fandom 2 up in Ottawa, Canada. So again, those of you who are gamers back in the late 70s, early 80s, lived in one of these areas, maybe recognize some of those names. I just thought it was kind of cool to take a look at those. Tips from the Tower, just sort of letting you know what's going on with them. They're excited to announce a new thing, which is they've gotten these boxes of miniatures in from Grenadier, their Wizards and Warriors set, the Dungeon Adventure set, the Monster set. Also from Judges Guild, they now have the Character Codex. We've done a video and looked at that product already. Under Storm Giant's Castle, one we haven't looked at yet, has come out. Wilderlands of the Magic Realm, which of course we're looking at here. Some sci-fi stuff, Starship and Spacecraft, which would be for Traveler. And then they're announcing this super adventure, which is Dark Tower from Janelle Jaquays, the first AD&D product they put out. And we'll talk about that one for sure. Have a video on that. I've been working on that for a while. It's just going to be, it's a pretty important product in my view, and I want to make sure, I do a good job of talking about it. Okay, next thing up is this long article on runic scrolls and translations by Brian Hennon. This is a Tolkien reference, and on the left at the top you can see this scratched out ruins he's written, and then a translation into English, and he's got a page in here, I think, where you can see the pronunciation for different things from the English language and then what rune you would use. And he's strongly encouraging DMs who really want to bring some flavor to the campaign to create, and he goes through in very great detail how he creates these scrolls or scraps of paper. He has some oil, he puts them in a cookie sheet, bakes them in the oven, takes them out, gets them crinkly, absorb the oil, maybe rips off some pieces here and there. But he likes this idea of writing out these ruins, and then when the characters come upon a scroll or a carving on a wall or whatever, handing it to the players, let them pass it around, kind of look at it. He thinks it'd be really, really cool. I certainly remember making scrolls myself back in the day. I don't know if I was quite as elaborate as him. And here he gives you some examples of these handwritten ruins on the left and then translations into English on the right. And the editor comments on how much work this was to get prepared for the actual printing of the fanzine, because those ruins obviously are not typeset. They had to be hand created. Just an interesting little historical note. They mention here two things. One, if you got the first version of Scrap Agate Green, Skulls and Scrap Agate Green, an adventure that we looked at, they forgot to include the maps, which will be in this issue, and they put them in there in a way that you could just sort of rip them out if you wanted to. And then in the City State, when they did a revised version of that written product, they had omitted certain tables and charts that they thought people wouldn't want or care about, but then they realized what people actually did, so they're going to have to put those back in for you. And so here, for example, is their chart on, I think this is basically the pricing guide to sell different slaves at a slave market. Okay, so here are the maps for Skulls and Scrap Agate Green, just so you know. If you've seen that video, you recognize these. But like I said, they didn't just forget one map, they forgot all the maps in the initial printing of that product. Short article from Kevin Dautremont about using slings in your campaign. He gives some thoughts about how the sling was used historically, and then he's got his suggested adjustments versus armor class. And his main point is that it was a hard lead projectile, and it was the blunt force impact that did the damage. So if you had hard armor like plate mail, it would actually translate that energy through into the body pretty well, whereas if you had maybe padded or leather armor, the ability of that armor itself to be sort of squished, if you will, would allow the armor to absorb a little bit more of the damage from the bullet. Okay, so here is some information from Mark Homer, the designer of the Wilderlands campaign, and he gives you some information to use on the campaign maps. And he has these things, they're called nexus points. I had a comment from one of our channel viewers who actually played with this and remembers seeing these at the time. So these nexus points on the map, sort of like dimensional, I think, concept. And so you could end up on one or the other map where these two maps came together, and you might end up on a completely different island, or the contents of the island would be completely different depending on which part of the nexus you ended up in. It would be super confusing if you're trying to actually map this stuff out for yourself. Ronald Pear, who was a contributor, I think, on my fanzine videos, I recognize that name from The Oracle, which was a really cool fanzine. But in any event, Ronald's got this great article here for NPCs, and essentially these are just pre-generated non-player characters you could use in your D&D campaign. He's got names, stats, and a little bit of information, a little color around who the person is to give you something to start with if you wanted to use these folks in your campaign. Okay. And then we've got the current happenings, which again, I think this stuff is kind of interesting for historical purposes because, and you could pause this if you want. This is just a list of different conventions around the country. Some of these are names that I recognize, like Origins and Gen Con, and then there are several others that I don't, but I just think it's kind of cool to see all these different conventions around the country, and they would do this for free. If you wrote in and told them about a convention that was occurring, they'd stick them in. And then the second page, the second half of that, they say these arrived after we'd already sort of typeset in order the other conventions. Then we got these notices. Didn't want to go back and reset the page, but we added them in here just so everybody could see the information about them. So here from Paul Pruitt is a chart you could use to roll up occupations. They could be for NPCs. They could also be some if you want to give sort of like a little bit of a background to your character. And I think the way this works, because it goes from 0 to 1,000, 3 rolls of a 10-sided die. They say if you just want to use what's in the D&D supplements, then roll a 6 for the first digit, so it can be 1 through 6, and then the second 2 digits on a D10. And this will only capture that stuff that goes up to 699. If you go from 100 to 900, essentially, those are things that would be outside of a city area. So someone who had a rural background or maybe lived in a forest, so you'd roll a 8-sided die and then 2 10-sided dies. So the first digit could be 1 through 8, and then the second digits would obviously be 1 through 10. Interesting concept there. It's not clear to me on this chart, because he only gives you a die roll, if they mean for the numbers that aren't listed to give you nothing, or it's supposed to be like the die roll says 002 is an idiot. So I don't know if that means 01 to 02 is an idiot, but basically, it's higher than the one before and up to the one that's there, or exactly how. Again, they didn't really give it a range. I think that would probably be what the idea was, rather than you'd end up with people with no occupation. And then they have a little bit of description about some of those occupations and how they work. They've got a new reminder of the contest that's going on, again, for creating a new dungeon. They did that, I think, 3 different times. And then we've got letters of marque by Bob Bledsoe. And this is a sort of optional rules he's created for people who want to go to the Overlord, right, the city-state of the Invincible Overlord, and ask for these letters that you would carry if you were on a ship, that essentially carry a seal and a sort of rite of passage from the Overlord that would say, hey, you need to let these guys go where they want to go, and if you don't, you're subject to being the penalty or the wrath of the Overlord, and his people come after you. Then they have some charts. This guy, Bob Bledsoe, loved charts for your town crier to talk about the kind of things that he might mention. And they've got a chart here, who the authorities are looking for today, problems that are going on, whether like we need to have, we're under attack, or we need to call generally for all able-bodied people to report for duty to protect the city, that kind of stuff. No end to the charts and the ideas that he came up with. Okay, Tom Holsinger, and has a little bit of information on magic items. And his point is that, magic armor is basically is in every other sense the same as regular armor, except it's enchanted, right? So it has a bonus. So when you look at it, it would just look like plate mail armor, chain mail armor, etc. Same thing he says with swords. He says that they weigh the same as a one-handed sword, attack as a one-handed sword when you use one-handed, or just two-handed sword when you use two-handed. And so he thinks that's the extent of the enchantment based on his reading of the rules. Then he talks a little bit about the gaining of hit points and says, obviously, you're not physically different as you gain hit points. You don't become bigger, or your body's doesn't gain stronger skin or whatever. And again, it's this idea, which Gary, I think, explained as well, which is as you go up, you just have the ability essentially to avoid, or absorb is maybe not quite the right word, more damage before your character succumbs to wounds. So then he has a related idea about the cure spells. And his idea is that it shouldn't cure a number of hit points, it should cure a percentage of hit points. And so like cure light wounds, he said if you think about a first level character, is maybe going to on average cure somewhere between 10 to 35% of your hit points, and that would be his suggestion. And as you go up to the higher level healing spells, he thinks rather than rolling dice, it should be a percentage of the character's hit points. And the idea is obviously so that a high level fighter can be mostly cured, for example, by a cure serious wound spell. I think that's an interesting concept. Could have been obviously the way the spell could have been written instead. And says, got some other thoughts here about, losing your hit points, going below, becoming unconscious, your ability to bind wounds to keep people alive, and so on and so forth. A clarification of character types by N. Morgan. And he wants to talk to you about clerics. And he basically just going through the different rules for the cleric and trying to explain those to you. He's got the ideas of armor and the different types of weapons you could use, different damage they should do versus man-sized or larger opponents. And he's got rules here as you gain levels and you do some praying, he says, to gain your different spells. And so, for example, I don't know, he seems to suggest maybe you gain a level in the middle of an adventure, which I don't ever think we had that rule. I think we always had to make you get back to town to gain your additional level. He's got his rules for undead. 1 attempt per turn to turn away the undead. He says it drains you, and so for the next, after you've done 1 turning, you won't be able to try and do that again for a little while, which is a variant rule as far as I know. Here's a little cartoon, double buffooned, starring Sir Laugh-A-Lot the Arrogant. Before we go on our contract, acquaintance, arms and armor in all combat frames, you call this armor. Let's get devious. How about another guy, a royal order and a rock, a rubber chicken? Are you now of the order of the chicken? And fellows meet Grog and his pet rock. And then it says, Harley, you've got the latest football armor. You guys will run together. And for good luck, here is Gumby. And then this goblin-looking guy says, sir, they have a Grog and a Gumby. And he says, so what? I don't know. Can't all be funny. Let's look at some great art. I always like looking at the art that's in these things. We've got this adventurer here. And then this battle where the guy looks like he stuck the wizard in the throat at literally the same time this guy shot him with some kind of magic missile that is blowing holes in him. It's a little violent. And then we've got some art here from Jaquays. We've got this the lady and the grumpy looking little halfling dude. And then from the backside we see this knight charging off into combat. And then a really cool drawing from Jaquays of this sorcerer who's summoning up a demon, I think. And then we've got Tim Kilgore's drawing of a couple of guys in combat. Towards the back, you get a new advertisement for the Great Adventure Dark Tower. It's like this super extreme view looking up from the feet of the statue. I think that's of Set. And that game has some ties to Egyptian mythology. And then there's just another piece of Jaquays art here on the right, which looks like I think an iron golem reaching down towards one of your player characters. In the back, we have the booty list, and as I say, one of the things you can always use this for. One, it's kind of interesting to see what's on the list, but you can look at the numbers, see how high they go, and help you understand where you are sort of in the chronology of Judges Guild product development. Here's the back page. You get 2 little cartoons. First, we've got Jaquays with the turkeys. It says, you might as well stay home, Fred. It's just a bunch of turkeys playing here tonight. Ba-dum-bum. And here's Rokio's art, which is the some type of demon creature, I think. Looks like he's casting the spell. Okay, let's take a look at this. Super cool. This booklet, which is 16 pages. And then you get the typical thing with the maps that are inside of here for the setting. Cover art by Jaquays. And remember, this cover gets edited, but the blue with the artwork shows up in the later printings where they combined product, or booklet 1 and booklet 2, and then they would sell that as one large product going forward. Here's our table of contents. Again, on the map, this covers an area called Gnor. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, and the Amont Tundra. They both sound kind of cool. Here is a picture, of the entire city-state, and then here's the maps we get this time. This is the Gnor area, And then this is the Ammont Tundra area down here at the bottom. And as I typically would do inside of here, you get information, very sort of sketchy information about this. So you get some hexes, the name of the village, of castles, and of lairs, where they are on the map. And basically, like for the castle, you just get the type of structure and then the stats for the person who's the head of that particular castle. The lair gives you some little monsters you could encounter around on the map. And then the really cool part I think about this are these lists of, sometimes it's a sentence, sometimes it's a whole paragraph, describing what you would find on various hexes on these maps, right? So like 0312, Isle of the Gold Flame. The larger of these two islands has over 700 small volcanic type cones protruding from the ground from 3 to 7 feet high. A golden flame will squirt out of the top about 50 feet above the cone. The smaller island has 300 cones, and at night the flames shoot into the air and give the isles an eerie and weird appearance. You could make it no more interesting than that. You could take it from there and make, something really, really interesting, a whole adventure campaign, a dungeon, aquatic adventure off the side of the island from that. And I think the real genius for me about the Judges Guild campaign setting is the endless amount of creativity a good referee dungeon master can take from this. And like I said, I feel like you could pick any one of these and take some time to create a campaign and a whole evening's adventure from that island. And I think I've seen a couple people in our community make comments about playing in this, and you could be playing a D&D campaign that's lasted since the 1970s and 80s for the last 45 years off of this stuff. I mean, I think it's really that deep in terms of how much creativity, how many adventure hooks, places to start, ideas are there just in this campaign setting. And of course, you've also got the two really, once we get to the other one, really detailed three, I guess, with Tarantus, right? Detailed city settings you could play in as well. So in addition to those are the islands, you have ruins and relics, and you've got a couple pages of those things. Again, you can see here, these are just a little bit shorter because they're not supposed to be much there. Were's our campaign map. Like you can see at the bottom, there's a bit of coastline, but the vast majority of this map is dominated by islands, and we'll take a look at those blown up just a little bit more. And oops, I'll go back. This is campaign map 11 for those who are keeping track of that stuff. And again, just little islands, some stuff up here at the top. I think it says Cruach Mountains. You've got a couple larger islands down here with some cities on them, and a bunch of little teeny tiny islands out there in the water. And we got the Devil Tongue Peninsula, the Shady Hills, the Great Unctuous Swamp down here at the very bottom. Cool stuff. Okay, then we go to the second map, the Ammont Tundra. We've got some villages there. Again, name, population, who the little stats for the ruler, castles or citadels that are located around the map here, and just statted out information about that leader. Lurid lairs, places where you'll find some type of monsters from the monster manual. And again, ruins and relics, these little adventure hooks that they give you here. You could do nothing more than just explain this and have it presumed to be kind of boring and hope your characters move on, or for every single one of these, I think you could stop and a DM could turn that into a whole evening's adventure if you really wanted to work out the detail and come up with some creative ideas. Again, a few islands off the edge of that. Here is the map for the tundra, and you can see this is mostly continent with just a little bit of water up here, top right. Here's a look at the 4 different parts of this map, which again is map number 14. That's it for Installment W from Judges Guild, which is the second half of the Wilderlands of the Magic Realm. Came out in April, May 1979. Hope you all enjoyed today's video. Hope you're enjoying the series, and I hope you're subscribed. Till next time, my friends, keep rolling 20s.